It's July. Some say it's a dead part of the sports calendar. I say it's when we start thinking about fantasy football. Peter, what we do on the show is a little bit different. You can go anywhere for a list of your top 30 running backs or quarterbacks or receivers. And obviously, training camps haven't even gotten going yet. What we want to do is take a step back and look at the bigger picture ideas of what leads to a breakout candidate and underdog at various positions. So we're going to start with running backs today and sort of give you guys who are listening some things to pay attention to as training camp starts, some trends, a little window into how we do our research, and then we got a couple guys to keep an eye on. But Peter, I guess I want to start out first by saying the two biggest breakout running backs last year, unexpected underdogs, were Jamal Williams and Josh Jacobs. And you could look at any group of statistics you'd like. You could look into any crystal ball you wanted. There was no indication that either of them was going to produce the way they did last year. Jamal Williams went from being a backup in Detroit to scoring 17 touchdowns. Josh Jacobs, there were rumors of him losing carries. Instead, he had his most efficient season ever. He doubled his rushing yards. So some of this is just, you can't predict baseball, Susan, right?
It sure is. And I remember thinking really early on last year that maybe Josh Jacobs would get even more carries. Maybe they would try to just wear him out instead of trying to re-sign him. And maybe they would just get conservative because they had been lucky the year before. But no. By the time training camp started, everyone was basically like, they're going to move a little bit away from him. I mean, they got great new receivers. Derek Carr is going to air it out. I mean, whatever else was going on, that guy wasn't supposed to become the bell cow for this run heavy team and go wild, but he did. So I think you're right. There's some things you just can't predict, but I also think, when we look at this, we're looking at this position by position, right? So there's stuff specific to the position that we want to consider, but we also have to realize that fantasy is changing, for the positions where production correlates really well with where players get drafted in fantasy leagues. Those correlations are getting tighter and tighter. It's actually getting harder in fantasy life to find surprises because I don't want to say we're all doing our own scouting. It's not like that, but we all now have access to the same, whether you think it's the top 6 or 10 or 15 or 30 experts out there who are doing their own scouting. It's almost like, what do they call it? An epistemic loop where everybody's talking to themselves. And so in the positions where that actually does predict performance, fantasy drafts are just getting better and better and better.
Yeah, there's so much information out there. There are so many people who do this full time for a living, analyze this year round, that it's getting harder to find a diamond in the rough. But we tried to do that anyway. So the way we've made our mark over the years, particularly with giant killers and bracket breakers in the NCAA tournament, is we look at trends over time and then we see what things are important and how do they apply to this year's group. So we've tried a similar approach with fantasy football. We looked, going back about 6-7 years, we compared running backs average draft position ADP to how they perform in terms of both points per game, total points. And then we looked at all sorts of factors. Did they have a new quarterback this season? Did they change teams? Were they hurt? What year of their career were they in? Wondering maybe, okay, older running backs, did they?
Right. How old are they? What were their workloads previously? Do you want to deliver the stunning, because it's kind of stunningly so boring conclusion to this search? We looked at everything we could look at.
Right. There's really no rhyme or reason in a lot of ways to who kind of emerges. Now, there are a few subtle trends we can look at, but it was pretty amazing to go as deep as we did in our research and not find any massive things pop out the way, say, offensive rebounding does in terms of college basketball upsets,
right.
or
steals,
right?
And that's because volume is what matters most. It's not to say that for a running back, it doesn't matter who your quarterback is or whether you're healthy or any of those things. It's not that. It's that volume is not just overwhelmingly important, but it sort of overlaps and subsumes everything else, because if you're healthy, you get more playing time, you get more carries. If you're surprisingly good, right? If you do come out of nowhere, you quickly get more carries and more volume and more points, right? That doesn't take a long time for that to happen. So as straightforward as it may seem, volume is what really dictates points. Now, how do you predict who's going to get giant increases in volume? That's that we have some ideas, but that's kind of tough. We just want to lay that out there. In other positions, wide receiver specifically, if there's inside information or there's breakout candidates or there's metrics that you can find that maybe correlate with points better than just how often you run the damn ball. But for running backs, it's a pretty tight correlation.
Right. And I want to get into a couple guys soon, but if you look at last year's biggest busts and then biggest breakouts, for instance, 9 of the 10 biggest busts were on the same team as in 2021. So it wasn't like there was like a big shift. Now, some of them got hurt. Javonte Williams, Chase Edmonds, Jonathan Taylor missed some time, Elijah Mitchell, and on and on and on. Half had new QBs, half didn't. But then if you look at the biggest risers, it's the same thing. 9 of the 10 players who had the biggest differences between what they were expected to do and how they performed were either rookies or returning to their team. There were guys who you had sort of thought, well, maybe with more opportunity would do well, but they weren't surprises. Ramondre Stevenson, Tyler Algier, Breece Hall, rookie with the Jets, right? Those opportunities came. Tony Pollard, everyone knew at this point that he was more talented running back than Ezekiel Elliott. He just needed the opportunity. So as Peter said, the single most important thing for running backs in particular is volume. So what you should be looking at now as we get closer to training camps, who's going to get the ball more than expected and who's going to do it behind a good offensive line.
Now let's jump right there for 1 second, because there is something interesting about the players who performed surprisingly well at running back. You might think a majority of these cases are like Tony Pollard, where a guy's playing behind another player who has obviously lost a step, who's slower, who's not as explosive. Tony Pollard is basically the only guy on the top 10 surprises list who that description applies to. Many of the rest of the biggest surprises, Latavius Murray, Jeff Wilson in Miami, Pacheco in Kansas City, Miles Sanders. These guys, what stood out about them last year is the yards per attempt they got before contact. These were guys who were plopped into systems with great offensive lines, right? So I don't want to say anybody could have done those jobs, but they were able to maximize the opportunities, not because they were undiscovered breakaway potential like speed guys, right? It's not like Cordero Patterson. It was guys who were put into systems like Zonovan Knight, another example. Now, Tony Pollard also has explosive yards after contact. These guys were barely broke average in yards after contact. Yards before contact were what mattered.
Peter, this is dovetailing with what you're seeing in real life. Now, I've long held the belief that running back was the most overrated position in football. To me, you make...
Well, Jordan, it's a real stretch to say that now in the year 2023. Who called you last night? Dalvin Cook? I mean...
Yeah, exactly. No, I've been saying this since like 2000. But look, you create a big enough hole...
and who called you then? Jamal Lewis? I mean...
Even you might be able to walk through it. So my point is now you're seeing, right? Running backs aren't getting paid, et cetera, et cetera. So it stands to figure that if you have a really good offensive line, and you can open up holes, that if your top running back goes down, you can plug and play somebody else in that spot. And that's exactly what we saw in terms of some of the biggest breakouts last year. So with that in mind, Peter, I want to ask you, looking at early ADP, where guys are going to draft, who outside of the top 25, top 30, are a couple of guys that you think could move into that group and are worth sort of a lottery ticket a little bit later in the draft?
I'll give you my absolute favorite. He's right on that border. He's going 30th in average draft position right now. I'm talking about James Cook in Buffalo. Mm-hmm. He has a growing role on a team that not only scored 455 points last year, but if you take Josh Allen out of their offense, they still averaged 3.2 yards before contact per attempt. They're blowing holes open for everybody, is what I'm trying to say. And now Devin Singletary's gone, and you could just see in the second half of last year. Look, for fans who are really into this, none of this is particularly surprising, but James Cook got 86 yards against Cleveland, and then started to get 40% of snaps. By the end of the year, he was up to over 50% of snaps. When he does break through those holes, he is explosive. He gained more than 3 yards after contact per attempt, 5.7 yards overall per attempt, which is pretty damn good, and made a lot of people miss tackles.
I'm with you on everything, except I will believe it when I see it that the Bills are committed to running the ball. They just fall into this pattern where it's pass to Josh Allen. I know they say they want to run it more. Let's
Okay.
see.
So let me give you three quick responses really quick.
Okay.
Number one, he's a good pass catcher. He had 21 receptions for 180 yards in about a third of a season's playing time. Whether or not they try to rely on Josh Allen a little less, he's going to have a role. Secondly, here's the thing. He's going in drafts behind unproven players and injury cases. He's going, and also players on terrible teams that are going to have a hard time moving the ball at all. He's going behind James Conner. He's going behind Cam Akers. He's going behind Alexander Madison. I don't think 30th represents his real value, there's just a tremendous upside. So I said three, but I'm going to stop
give me a quick hitting other guy before I give you my brilliant picks.
Way deeper than that. I
Okay.
love Roschon Johnson of the Bears, 4th-round running back. But look, if he gets the starting job, that's another team that, even if you adjust for the fact they have a great running quarterback, was blowing holes open. At Texas, he had not only size, but agility. He had a 49% missed tackle rate his senior year. That's the fourth. His metrics are basically the 4th best running back in the draft, in a draft that a couple of were going to be possibly all-time greats. Look, there are teams that run well and run a lot. They include Atlanta, Baltimore, the 49ers, usual suspects. Chicago's like that, even accounting, again, for Justin Fields. And so you drop him in there, he's comparable to the kinds of running backs that have surprised and maximized their opportunities.
All right, let me give you a couple guys that I'm looking at. First of all, they're both outside of the top 30. I'm not looking for guys who you're going to take in the first few rounds anyway, and maybe,
Well, Roschon Johnson's running back 53. You got anybody lower than that?
Fair enough. Okay. The first guy I'm looking at, for a variety of reasons, is Samaje Perine. He signed with Denver as a free agent. He's currently going as running back 37 in early drafts. Here's the case for Perine. First of all, Sean Payton wanted him, met with him, chose Denver with a similar contract offer to stay in Cincinnati. Second thing is, Javonte Williams is coming back from an ACL and I think PCL injury. Okay. We saw last year J.K. Dobbins really didn't recover from that for Baltimore. The idea that Javonte Williams is going to be the same player this season is tough to swallow at best. So that creates potentially more opportunity for Perine. He's also a really good pass catching back. Sean Payton's offense has always featured pass catching backs. Russell Wilson has been looking to dump down more. So, and finally, Pro Football Focus has the Broncos offensive line ranked 11th in the NFL. So there are a number of scenarios where you could possibly get top 20 value out of Perine at the 37th spot. So that's
right.
That's
Talking about dropping a guy into a situation that's really well,
right.
He's going to sleep in a bed that's made very nicely for him, I think.
Right. Look, or Javonte Williams comes back and he's totally healthy and he rushed for 1,800 yards. But what I'm saying is pay attention in training camp to how that evolves. And it's worth, again, compared to some of the other guys going in that spot, it's worth a look. Similarly, Rashad Penny is signed in Philadelphia. They've completely redone their running back room. Obviously, they have DeAndre Swift. He is the big name free agent addition. He obviously has a ton of talent, but he also has an injury history. And it's not out of their own possibilities that he gets hurt, or that Penny, who's always been an attractive talent and has also had trouble staying healthy, now they're behind arguably the best offensive line in football. It's not outside of their own possibilities that something comes up with Swift and that Penny leapfrogs. And if you Miles Sanders was a top 20 running back on that team last year with Jalen Hurts vulturing a lot of touchdowns. I could see Penny fighting his way into more carries. Again, for a guy going 39th among running backs at drafts, I think there's value. So just pay attention to those two situations in training camp, see how they evolve. And remember, if you're looking to take a flyer on someone in the mid to late rounds, target a good offensive line where there's a plug and play opportunity, and target someone behind a running back who has some sort of a concern about why they may be able to hold on to a starting job.